Roger, you're so prompt. First one. Hi, everyone. Everybody say hi in the chat. It's nice to see everyone today. The confetti. Everyone loves our confetti. So we are here today with our second installment of our OWASP October series. If you haven't met me before, I'm Christine Bevilacqua. I work with Dan and Corey over on the AppSecU side. And we're also joined today by a special guest, Damilola Abiona. If you haven't heard her speak, you absolutely should go catch the replays of our most recent AppSecCon, where Damilola had an incredible presentation. And if you're new to AppSec University, definitely check out her session. She talked about how she found AppSec University. Actually, you can explain it. And you created an entire course, correct, Damilola, yourself, that to help navigate people through how to get the most out of AppSec University if you're brand new to API security. Do you want to give us a little plug about your course?
Oh, hi. Hello, everyone. My name is Damilola Abiona, and for the last AppSec conference, I spoke about training the next generation of API hackers. And I talked about how my journey started and how I found out about AppSec University after filling an interview regarding API security. So I discovered AppSec University after that. And it actually helped me come up with a challenge of training other people in API security. Talent won't just go and miss out on opportunity just because of lack or knowledge gap in API security.
Yeah, it was a phenomenal session. And I think that you're launching the Hack with Dammy, the live session. Is it next month that you're launching it?
Yes. So next month we'll be opening up a series called Hacking APIs with Dami. So it's going to be everywhere, LinkedIn, Twitter. So we're going to launch by November.
Awesome. So we'll have to have you back on in November and go through it in a dedicated session, but we're really excited about that. So without further ado, I'm going to pop into today's session. So let me pop it up. So today is OWASP API number 9. We're going to be talking about improper inventory management, our shadow APIs of the night. And we've got some examples here for you. And then Damilola is going to actually go through a live kind of hands-on lab for how you go about looking for old or outdated APIs that are in your inventory. Let's take it away. Hold on just a minute. All right. So OWASP API number 9, improper inventory management. What is it? What are we talking about? So here we're talking about our failures to discover, track, and manage our full API attack surface. That means anything from older or outdated versions, your undocumented endpoints, developer artifacts that are sitting out there. These tend to be very difficult to detect in runtime. And we are also talking about third-party integrations here. So basically, the moral of the story is your forgotten assets remain reachable and are very easy for attackers to exploit. Some examples of this would be your non-prod or your legacy endpoints that are left public. If you've got old documentation, stale open API docs, right? If you're exposing your developer tooling or your support artifacts, and then just any sort of scope, like poorly scoped API keys, right? Long-lived API keys. And the end result, as you'll see in just a minute here, I'm going to share a couple of breach examples. The end result is bulk data exfiltration, credential misuse, lateral movement, and supply chain pivoting. We have, I think everyone here is probably aware, but we do have a full course on OWASP, on all of the OWASP API top 10. So if you haven't already taken that, I would encourage you to go out and take that. It's a great resource, and it really very closely follows the OWASP definitions. We use examples for all of the OWASP API number 9. I think I brought 2 new examples today that we didn't share in the course, but it's a great course, and it'll give you detailed information on all of the OWASP API top 10. So our first example today is Stripe, right? This was a real world skimmer campaign that used a legacy Stripe API as a validation oracle. This attack is a great case study for why your old undocumented assets and developer era APIs can be dangerous to you, right? So what happened here? How did it work? Why did it work? How was it discovered? And then, let's talk a little bit about what we as cybersecurity professionals could have done to detect and prevent it. Disclaimer. So Damilola is again going to give us a hands-on lab. Make sure that when you're testing for things like this, authorized testing only, please. We're all here to learn defensively and to stay on the right side of the organizations out there that we're testing for. So attackers are pragmatic, right? They don't want huge dumps of invalid card numbers. That creates pointless work. It raises a lot of red flags. So in this case, the attacker's plan was targeted. They injected a skimmer into checkout pages. They captured card details and shoppers' types, and then they validated those cards in real time. So only validated usable cards would be exfiltrated. And the validation step, that last step, was what made this campaign very efficient and very lucrative. The thing that elevated this skimmer beyond the ordinary campaign was the malicious JavaScript that called a legacy Stripe endpoint, right? So api.stripe.com/v1/sources to check whether captured card number appeared valid or active. And because that endpoint still accepted the legacy style lookups, the attackers were able to test the cards on the fly, and they were then they were able to only exfiltrate those cards that passed, right? Or those records that passed. So multiple researchers flagged this as kind of the most important efficiency improvement, if you will. Legitimate legacy vendor APIs became a valid or a valuable attacker tool. How did the skimmer get into so many stores? So attackers, they went and targeted merchants that were running on popular e-commerce platforms like WooCommerce, PrestaShop, and others. And then the typical vectors there were outdated plugins or themes, right? Stolen admin credentials, compromised third-party scripts. And so once they were able to inject the malicious JS executes into the shopper's browser, those intercepted the card inputs before the legitimate payment flow, and it performed the validation step that we talked about earlier. So when they initially reported this, they reported, I think it was like 4950 merchants that were attacked in that first wave. And then there were more subsequent to that. And if you were looking at like, how did this boil it down to kind of root causes, if you will? The first root cause, and most important, and what we're here talking about today, was the legacy Stripe API that remained active and reachable, right? That's an inventory lifecycle failure. Then the second were that the merchants' front ends were also compromised, which made it easy for attackers to get to those client-side access to those credit card fields. And then third, the attackers were able to use the legitimate API as an oracle, if you will, to validate the stolen data, which dramatically improved their signal to noise efficiency. And then lastly, this was an entire ecosystem level inventory failure, right? And migration gaps. Some merchants hadn't moved to the newer Stripe flows. And so that leftover capacity or capability was able to be weaponized. So I think there's a lot of different points of failure here, but the most important and the primary point of failure was that legacy Stripe API that remained active and easily reachable. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to keep an eye on the comments, but if you're asking questions, I'll hop to them in just a minute. I'll take a pause between Stripe and the next example. We just covered this, but the root cause is that legacy API was still active, client-side compromises, the validation via legitimate API reduced the noise, and then for sure that inventory transition gap, right? We talk a lot about our own API inventory management, but that third-party piece is really important as well, especially in ecosystems like this, where you've got a lot of commerce partners who are still using deprecated flows, right? So something to think about. So I'm just going to hop into the chat really quick and see if we've got. Sorry, what are the slides not moving? Oh, here. Why the constant slide changes? I'm sorry. Was it not? Should have been moving. Sorry about that, guys. I'll do a better job of keeping an eye on the slides. And I'm going to turn off are petty. Oh my gosh. Okay. Sorry, I'll try and keep these side by side so I can see the slides better. So let's go to the next slide, which is our detection signals. I don't know why these are jumping so fast. Sorry. User error. Here we go. Okay. So back into our detection signals. So if you look at the client side telemetry first, if your browser network trace shows requests to something like api-stripe.com/v1 sources originating from your checkout pages, that's obviously a red flag. I think, Dami, you're going to show us something similar to that in just a minute when you run your demo. Also monitor for the new third-party script domains, right? SRI hash changes or any unusual script initiators. And then on the server side, you want to watch for abnormal patterns during checkout, like high script loads, requests originating from unexpected referrers, things like that. And we do have some handouts that, like, if this is something that's an area of interest for you, or if it's an area that you're focused on at your organization, we do have some great takeaway resources. If you just pop a note in the chat, I will get those over to you. But we built a couple of handouts on how to go about doing this in your organization. So let me jump to the next slide. Optus. This is our next example. So Optus is probably one that you've all heard about. This was a few years back. Optus, I think it was in like 2022, and it started with Optus engineers observed some unusual activity, right? And then a couple of days later, the company publicly disclosed. If you're not familiar with Optus, it's a huge organization in Australia. This was like one of the biggest data breaches in Australian history, and it actually caused changes at the regulatory level. So the government came down hard on Optus as a result of this breach. And we'll talk a little bit about what data was exposed, but law enforcement ended up being involved. The government ended up being involved. It was a really big deal. It was a huge percentage of the Australian population whose sensitive data, like driver's license information, home addresses, things like that, were breached in this. And it was a massive scale, right? I can't remember what I want to say. It was like a third of the population. And it was everything from, again, driver's license number, passport photos and passport information, birth date, addresses, phone numbers, everything. And I think it was like 9 to 10 million of their former customers. So it was huge, huge breach. So what happened here was an attacker scraped data from an Optus endpoint that returned full customer data, right? And rather than it being a one-off leak, the attacker was able to query and harvest 10 million records from the interface and then started posting random data and leaking that data online. And what they found was that it was a legacy API endpoint that was the exfiltration vendor. And about a year after this happened, right, what was publicly disclosed was that there was an endpoint that was basically didn't have authorization on it that it should, or authentication on it that it should have had. And so they called it a coding access control error. But in essence, the access controls were flawed because it was an older version of an API that didn't have the newer authentication mechanisms in place. And because of that, it allowed bulk retrieval of data, right? They tried to brush it off as this was just a coding error in an API, but really it was multiple things, right? It was an inventory management failure because they left old legacy API endpoints out there, and it was an authentication error. So I think both of those things were true. And we have a more detailed breakdown of this as well. But I wanted to leave you with a few key takeaways on Optus before we jump into the demo. The client side compromise and legacy endpoint offer high return on investment for attackers, right? So they're definitely going to look at those. If you're thinking about how do you protect against this, obviously inventory management, huge area of focus. Cross-layer telemetry as well is a great defense. And then this is more around the authentication, but remove your old scripts, rotate your keys, right? And longer term, make sure that you're retiring those deprecated APIs. I'm missing some of my notes on this, so I'll come back and talk about it in a second. But I think the biggest thing with Optus, aside from just like the lack of inventory management, is really the scope of the impact and how we don't necessarily think sometimes of, we think of the economic impact to an organization, but this was months of like their entire organization basically being caught up in addressing this breach that was the result of just one single legacy API endpoint that was left out there. Massive impact for what is classified as a coding access control error. Lola, do you want to take the reins and watch, and we can watch your demo really quickly?
All
And
right,
then,
thank you so much, Kristen.
yeah, sorry, before we close, so Damilola is going to run us through how she looks for legacy API endpoints manually, and then we'll talk a little bit about how you could do it in an automated way, right? As your every time code gets updated, watching for those outdated endpoints. And then we'll talk a little bit about what are some best practices for improper inventory management. And we'll close with a little quick demo on Bolt if you haven't seen it yet. So with that, take it away, Damilola.
All right, thank you so much. Going to be sharing my screen to demo how to find legacy APIs that are untracked, or maybe after fixing issues on one, they leave the other one unprotected, and attackers could still do or find vulnerabilities on the previous one. Okay, so please confirm you can see my screen.
Let me pull it up. There we go. Now we can see it.
Okay, I'm going to be using this application called Vulnerable Bank. And I want you guys to follow me as we run through this. And then we're going to be using Burp Suite to intercept traffic. So the first thing we want to do is register on this application. And we're going to call it the username. And please, I want you to note this dashboard for creating accounts. You can say what they're asking us for is username and password only. So we're going to call the username OWASP9. And then I'm just going to make the password like 4 figures. So we have just 4. I'm doing this in such a way that when I eventually do whatever I want to do, you will know that there's different in like change of password. Then I register. So our registration is successful. Now let's try to sign in. So we have OWASP9 and we'll sign in regularly, a new user. So this is what the dashboard looks like. So this is just to show you that the application works and all of that. So let's assume that I forgot my password. Remember that at the stage of registration, there was no email and all of that. How you sign up is just your username and then your password. So let's say we've forgotten our password and we'll try to log in, said invalid credentials. So I want to come here and say, I want to reset my password. And now I'll put in my username. And from here, I could request my PIN. But I want you to notice something here. We have this API version 2. So if there is a version 2, that means there used to be version 1. Now look at the prompts we got. We're asked to get our reset PIN from our email. And remember that when we're trying to sign up, there was no email. So how do we get this email? So let's go to Burp Suite and see what is happening behind the scene. So I have this. I have my forgot password endpoint here, and I have API version 2 forgot password. So let's look at what is in the request to be sure that's our username. So we have this, which is OWASP9, which is our username. And then for our response, we have this debug info, and which also has the timestamp and then our username OWASP9. But then there is a message here that says reset pin has been sent to your email. We did not any email while signing up. At this point, you want to find every means of being able to reset your password. So I'm going to send this to my repeater. Whenever you see an application or you're testing an application or an API, even maybe web or just an API, or the web application is calling an API and it has maybe version 2 or version 3, the first thing you want to do is to check if you still have access to the previous version. If there's API documentation, you could actually check if there's a documentation on how the version 1 works, the version 2, why they upgraded to version 2, and then why they moved to version 3. So most time when they move to a new version, it's basically for patching. Maybe there was an issue with the previous version and then they fixed that issue. So they migrated to version 2 where the fix has been done. Now, let's try to change this to V1. Oh, sorry, that's a mistake. And let's see what we have here. And as you can see from our response under the debug info, we have the pin. This issue or this vulnerability has been fixed in version 2, but in version 1, we're able to get our PIN without providing email. This could actually lead to account takeover. So if you just know any random person's username on this application, you could easily reset their password and take over the account without having access to their email. So I'm going to use this PIN to try and change my password so I can confirm if this is actually valid. So I'm going to put in my PIN here. And remember, my other PIN was just 4 numbers. So I'm going to make 4 figures. So I'm just going to make this password. Meanwhile, this is bad password practice. Your password should not be 4 figures or numbers, or it has to be complex. So let's just make this 8. And you see our password reset is successful. So let's try to sign in with the new password. And as you can see, we are in. So this is a classic example of OWASP 9, Improper Inventory Management. What happened in this application is the developer tried to fix the issue that actually occurs in version 1, which is this pin, which is being exposed in the response. But unfortunately for them, they did not revoke access to this version 1. Whenever there is a new version, they should track the previous version to see if it is still accessible to the client or anybody or even an attacker. So yeah, this is the demo for the API WAPS 9 API vulnerability. So whenever you're testing an API, always check if you have access to the previous version. Most times it's because there's an issue in the previous one. That's why they moved to the old one. Best practices, always, if you're a developer, always make sure the previous version is no longer available for use. Have moving on to the new one. Thank you very much. That is it.
Sorry. We have a couple questions there, Dami. So the first one was, how frequently does the version slip happen?
Anyways, it's most time it happens because sometimes the developers they scale it. It can just be luck. You might just find it. So it's always good to check out for it. So it depends on the application. So it's not about how frequently, but it's always worth it as a security tester and application security engineer to always look out for this vulnerability, especially when you have different version of the API. So always check. You might just it's very straightforward and you might just eat something really interesting.
Yeah. Tom, so you're asking which software was being used for the vulnerable bank demo. That was Burp, correct, Damilola?
Come again. What question is
what
that?
was the software that you were using for the vulnerable bank demo? What were you just using? Yeah.
Okay, I was using Burp Suite Professional to intercept the traffic. And then this vulnerable bank is available to everyone.
Yep.
It's an application built by a Nigerian, Alamir Badmos.
Yeah, so you can also go out to, I think most of you probably are in there. If you go, you can use Burp Suite. As Damilola said, she's using the pro version. You can also, our free scanner, the AppSec free scanner, which I'll drop the link in here. You can also use that. So you can, if you want to test on known vulnerable apps, I think Crappy has this vulnerability in it. This vulnerable bank app has this vulnerability in it. You can use our AppSec scanner to show you how to create and automate those tests as well. So something to think about. If this is an area that's under your scope at your organization, absolutely you can manually test for these things. It's much easier if you have some sort of an automation in place that every time a developer checks in new code, you're running preventative tests against that for things like OWASP API number 9. So it would be hard. I know I saw a comment in here about the developer should just overwrite their previous version with a new version. That would be fantastic, but it's not always the same developer and they don't necessarily know what's out there. It's very easy at the speed of development for this kind of thing to occur and for them not to necessarily know what other APIs are out there. And their core mission is not securing old legacy APIs that are out there. It's developing new functionality and pushing that out to market. I'm just putting AI the link here. But the other valuable thing, if you're going to go play with the AppSec scanner, is that you can actually go and look at what the scripted tests are, how it's testing for these. And that could give you some help as well if you did try to manually test for this. Sign up. Sorry, can't type and talk. Dan's much better at typing and talking at the same time than I am. All right, so I am going to close out with a few, hang on one second here. I got to jump back to where we were. A few best practices. Again, if you have any questions for either of us, go ahead and drop them in the chat. Sorry, I know this is slow. There we go. Is that the one we want? Yes. Okay. So in terms of, and Damilola, feel free to jump in if you want to add some thoughts here. Let's talk a little bit about how to prevent OWASP API number 9 vulnerabilities from being exploited. Our first kind of pro tip or takeaway is create and maintain a canonical API inventory, right? So that means cataloging every host, every version, your open API and Swagger files, know what's in your Postman workspace, right? What are your dev and staging endpoints? And again, those third-party integrations. Ideally, you can automate discovery here. There's a lot of different ways to do that. There's not like a magic bullet, but definitely you can look at CT logs, your DNS subdomain scans. You can do looking at gateway logs. If you're doing that, if you're automating discovery, what you're trying to do is flag anytime runtime endpoints anytime you see runtime endpoints that are not in the registry. Easy for me to write and not easy for me to say. The next point is retire or isolate legacy endpoints. So make sure, and this is something that's hard for us, right? This is more of kind of a dev engineering mandate, but making sure that you're enforcing a formal deprecation lifecycle. You announce, you monitor, you retire. And if older APIs have to remain, make sure that you're moving it behind those stricter current controls and ideally isolating them from production data. The next one is enforce server-side auth and least privilege. So make sure that you're implementing strict principles around resource authorization checks, that you have short-lived scoped API keys and tokens, that you're using per key rate limits, and that you're denying by default any undocumented paths. The next is protect developer artifacts and secrets. So treat your docs, your HARs, your exported collections and CI artifacts as sensitive. Make sure that you're blocking public uploads, you're sanitizing your examples, you're requiring vaulting for secrets, and rotating any long-lived keys immediately. And then this last one is detect cross-layer anomalies and practice response. So combine RUM browser telemetry with your API gateway or your SIM alerts for your endpoint versus spec drift, and bulk reads, right? So run tabletop IR exercises, have automated contain playbooks ready. And I think that's we're trying to sum it up. There's a lot more than just this, but I didn't want to have 5 slides. So as I said, we prepared a couple of handouts that actually go into detail on how to address and what you can do kind of organization wide to improve your inventory management posture. And I think, is that AI web app dev? I'm not sure what the question is, Rishi. Maybe if you can, AppSec AI is a testing tool. I'm not sure what your question is. If you want to elaborate, I will be happy to answer. I'm about to get to Bolt, sorry. Any methods that we can use to detect APIs and perform some type of attack surface management. Damilola, how do you handle this? Detecting APIs.
Okay, if you've taken the 12-hour course by Koribo on AppSec University course, there are so many ways to do this. So you could also use a tool called Kite Runner to detect API endpoints. You can also look for undocumented API documentation and all of that. So there are several ways to actually do this.
Yeah. And this is a cool tool that we just put out there. It's in beta right now. So if you want to play around with this, it's a plugin, a Chrome browser extension. And this is a great way to play around with what's on your web apps as well. You can run it at the domain level. You can click around and it's going to be mapping every API that's running on that web page. So it's pretty cool. We're definitely looking for feedback. So expect that if you sign up for the beta, we are going to be pinging you and asking you to help us with your feedback so that we can make this even more powerful and a great tool for the industry. I think that its early results people are really impressed. It's pretty powerful and it's just fun to play with, to be honest. So if you haven't already signed up for it, if you did sign up, you should have gotten an email yesterday. If you already signed up for this, look in your email. It came from Dan. There were instructions on how to go get the plugin in that email. If you did sign up and you didn't get that email, you can send me a note. I'm going to type my email address in here, and I will make sure that I get you those instructions today. If you signed up after yesterday morning, I just haven't done a sweep yet. So anyone who signed up after yesterday morning, I'll catch you as soon as I'm done with this session today, and I'll send you the instructions on how to get the beta. The link to sign up on Bolt. Yeah, hold on. Oh, thank you, Often. Yeah, so if you click that link, it's just a type form. Just fill it out. I'll send you an email with the instructions on where to go to get it. You'll need to request access, and Dan or I will approve access as quickly as we can. Any other questions before we jump? Any questions for Dami? Okay. I'm going to close down questions then. So our next session is next week. It's next Tuesday, and this will be OWASP API number 7, server-side request forgery. And our theme for that is possessed requests, the poltergeist. So we're going to be talking about metadata raids, lateral peaks, invisible hands, what happens inside server-side request forgery. Super excited for that. I think Jesse is going to be hosting that. I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure it'll be Jesse, but we'll be back on Tuesday. And again, these run every Tuesday and Thursday for this entire month, plus the first week of November. If you have any specific ideas or thoughts or requests for what you want to see covered in the series, let us know. Hopefully today has been valuable to you guys, and thank you again for joining. And by the way, if you sign up for these, if you go sign up for this, hey JP, if you didn't see Tuesday's recording, it'll be out on our YouTube channel this afternoon. Tuesday's recording and today's recording will be on YouTube by the end of the day, and we'll just keep publishing them. We usually get them up the day after. I'm just a little bit behind on Tuesdays, so they'll be up today. And you can watch number 1. That was Bola with Corey and Dan from Tuesday. If you sign up for next Tuesday's session, there should be an option when you sign up to sign up for the entire series so that all of them get dropped on your calendar. I think that's it for us. Thank you so much, Damilola. I really appreciate you joining us and running us through the demo. Again, anyone who has questions or needs anything, you've got my email in the chat. Go sign up for Bolt, play around with it, give us your feedback. And definitely, if you haven't already, check out the free testing tool that we offer. I think that link is in the chat as well. So I'll leave the chat up and live for a little while here. But thank you all for joining us. Have a great weekend.